Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the After the Timeout podcast, sponsored by the IBCA. We are a global podcast that shares the passion for the coaching profession. You will hear the stories of coaches from all around the world. We are covering the profession in game, outside of the game, and anything in between. As always, thank you for listening. We look forward to sharing the coaches' stories with you.
Welcome back to another episode of After the Timeout podcast. Today we have a great guest, Mike Miller, retired head coach of Rockford, Guilford, Galesburg, Elgin, Hononegah, and South Beloit. Coach, how you doing today?
I'm great. Yeah, thanks for having me this morning.
Well, thanks for joining us. We look forward to it. So, done this with all our guests since the beginning. Listeners kind of really like it just to get started and get a background on you and where you came from. We call it the opening tip. So we just asked you to tell us a little bit about your journey. Maybe how you started, how you finished, where you went along the way, all that good stuff, so our listeners can get a little background.
Well, I went to Rockton Hononegah High School. I played there and grew up in a basketball family. My dad was a really good player at Northern Illinois, and so I grew up around the game and went to Hononegah, and then actually had a chance to play at Rock Valley College and William Penn, and then decided I was going to be a teacher. And I was a seventh grade basketball coach for my first couple of years. And then Hononegah gave me the opportunity to be both the assistant freshman coach and the assistant varsity coach. They had a budget cut where they didn't have an assistant varsity coach. So to get it back, that's kind of how I got my high school opening. And a year later, I ended up getting the Rockford Guilford job. And then, 24 years old, then it kind of took off from there where, I was at Guilford for 3 years and then Guilford for 5 years, Galesburg. Then I went at Vanderbilt University for a year and Elgin for a year, and then Hononegah, and finished up at South Beloit. So I've been around. I've seen pretty much all over the state of Illinois, and had a great run.
So, Todd and I like to do our homework on our guests, and I was kind of researching you, and I found out you were a head coach at 24 years old. And I was thinking back to when I was 24 years old, and I became a head coach at 28, 29, and I didn't think I was ready at 28, 29. Thinking back to that first year as a head coach, maybe what were some things that you look back and you're like, man, I really wasn't ready for that. And then I was also thinking about what was it like to kind of coach some high school seniors who are basically 6 years younger than you, and you're the head coach.
Yeah, it was really kind of a strange situation. Rockford Guilford at the time did not have a teaching job, so they were kind of limited on who they could hire. And then two, it was a situation where they were not very good the year before, so I think there was only 6 applicants. Craig Callahan, who was the head varsity coach at Hononegah at the time, went down and said, hey, you need to interview this kid. And I went down there and I had a couple interviews, and I found out later the athletic director was Jan Jameson, who had won a state title in football. I was a wrestling coach, was a head football coach, just a great guy, bear of a guy, one of those, like, he looked like a polar bear. And he told me that, years later, that the final interview after I left, there was some assistant principals that were like, no way, this kid is too young. He's 24, he looks 18, and there's no way that we can hire this kid. And Jameson said, he put his big paw in the middle of the table and slammed it down and said, we're hiring the kid and I'm babysitting him. And he did, and so he was a great mentor. He was just a rough and tumble guy. Like, I was in my 20s and he's in his 50s, and he wouldn't know anything about basketball, but he'd come and check on me in the gym and like bear hug you to say hello. And I'd be sore for like 3 days, but he was just a great guy kind of taking care of me. And, the best thing I think I did was my assistant coach was Frank Cushing, who was a big time psychologist in our town. And he was in his 40s, and he kind of gave us the veteran presence that we needed because, I was 24. One of my other assistants, Augie Toldos, a friend of mine, was 24. And then we hired Brian Hansen, who is now the head coach of LaSalle Peru, St. Bede, and he was 20 at the time. So we had a super young staff, and there was numerous games where I'd be standing up coaching, and the refs would run by and say something to Frank Cushing, who was in his 40s. Hey, tell this young kid to sit down. You can't have your assistant stand up all the time. So it was definitely, I was 20 years younger than any other head coach. Back, 35 years ago, you didn't see young people being the head coaches. Everybody in the league was my dad's age, and so it was definitely a different situation, but I lucked into having a great group, and we made some pretty good things happen.
So you mentioned your time at Vanderbilt there. Maybe kind of what led to that? What was the situation there? Were you going to school? What were you doing? And then what did that experience teach you? And then how did you take those experiences and apply it to your next head coaching job and your next positions? What did you learn down there?
Well, I was very fortunate in that when I was at Guilford, we had some very good players, and good players expose you to college coaches through recruiting, and I was always someone that was very interested in the X and O's and wanted to soak up anything I could. And so I got to meet Kevin Stallings through the recruiting process. And he recruited a kid that we had at Guilford named Ben Holmstrom, who ended up going to Miami of Ohio. And then he recruited a kid at Galesburg named Joey Range that ended up going to Iowa. And he hired me after the Galesburg situation. He'd always joke that I'm the only high school coach in the country that got hired that never ever gave a player to the head coach. Both of my guys that he wanted went to other places. It was a situation where Vanderbilt was just such a great learning experience, being around in that room. When I was there, we had Tim Jankovich, who went on to be an assistant, the head coach at Illinois State and then SMU. Steve Sharina, who was at Davidson as an assistant coach and was the head coach at Western Carolina. Jeff Jackson, who's ended up being the head coach at Furman. Brad Frederick, who's one of the top assistants at North Carolina to this day. Just being exposed to those kind of basketball minds was tremendous. It was kind of like going to school every day. It was great.
So we wanted to kind of get into a little bit more of your experience with your alma mater and growing, coming back to a community you grew up in. There's dozens of great things about going back and home of serving your community, but were there any challenges you faced or extra pressure you put on yourself to kind of make Hononegah what you wanted it to be?
Well, for sure. I think, Hononegah was probably, not one of the jobs I had where we maybe weren't the most talented as maybe some of the other schools that I've coached at. So that obviously was a challenge, but it was great for me to be around family. But with that comes some great things, some tough things. I ended up coaching a couple of my cousins, which was great. But then all of a sudden, you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you're like, hey, how come you're not playing my kid? Or, some of those type of things. I used to tell people all the time, the difference that coaching at your alma mater is if you're at some other school, the guy yelling at you, you don't really know. But when you're at your alma mater, the guy in the third row has been your mailman for 20 years. You're like, hey, Bob, quit yelling at me, Bob. All these people, so I had a great experience. People were great to me. So we had very, very little problems over the years. But, it is tough when you have relationships with people and all of a sudden, you're got to make decisions and, I cut, a kid that the son of somebody that was really, really close to me, and, sometimes that can put some strains on some relationships, when you have some different kinds of stuff that way. But it was I enjoyed it. Hononegah is a different animal in that it's so big and it's grown, when my history, my grandma went there in the 1920s. There was 200 kids. And then my parents went there in the 1960s. Actually, my grandma was in the 1930s then. So my parents went there in the 1960s and there's 400 students, 500 students. I went there in the 1980s and it was 1,000 and now it's over 2,000 kids. So it's really not the same place that I was always in just because it's grown so much. It's also a definite kind of niche school where, it was funny. I went to Wrigley yesterday and I ran into a kid that was a really good baseball player at our school. And, I coached there for 20 some years and this kid's been out of school for 4 or 5 years or something. And I said, oh yeah, I remember watching you pitch, you're a really good baseball player. He had no clue who I was. So it was a situation where I went from Galesburg where you had 2 radio shows and a couple newspapers following you and a situation, you go to the grocery store and people are stopping you to, in Rockton, I could be at Walmart and no one knows who I am. So as much as it was my hometown, it was a different situation than maybe what I grew up with.
So, Honey, a very rich tradition in both boys and girls basketball. Obviously, while you were there, you had success. The girls' side was excellent. Tell us about the things in that community that help Hononegah basketball be so good consistently.
Well, I think some of it is you've got a parent group that's going to have their kids involved. I think you have camps. They're going to show up for camps. They're going to do the extra stuff. I think the one, you're going to see some type of commitment. Each school has this kind of different challenges and different things. But one of the things I think you take for granted is, if I signed up for the Palatine Summer Shootout, I'd have 15 kids waiting for me. They'd drive an hour and all of a sudden you've got such parent involvement that you've got everybody there wanting to play, wanting to try to get better, doing the different kinds of stuff. And I think, when you have a school that has some of the advantages that Hononegah has, and now they've made such commitment to facilities, there's really a situation where they have a chance for success for sure. In everything, in all sports. I mean, I think they've won the all sports trophy in the Nick 10 conference for about, 10, 15 years in a row or something. And I think, there's just quality all through the school.
So I do have an interesting follow. So, you kind of mentioned the parent involvement and the investment by the kids. And then, that's not everywhere, right? And I think as we get, at least as I get, 20 years into my career, sometimes you see it less and less, and kids are doing so many things and parents are doing so many things. And coach, I got to work. Coach, I got 3 sports. Coach, I got this. Coach, I got that. How, as a coach, would you say to other coaches, maybe young head coaches, to kind of create that parent buy-in, to create that student athlete buy-in?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's changed over time. I think in the 30 some years I did it, it went from, I think early in the time when I started, it was very definitely coach dominated. And then I think parents kind of had a lot of control for a while. And now I think what it really needs to be is probably where it is there should be a partnership. I think, sometimes I think you can kind of keep parents like at a distance. I think every coach knows that parental issues can be a problem. But I think the answer is more communication. I think you have to kind of sit there and say, okay, here's what the expectations are. Here's what I need. What do you need? Because these kids, it's different now. With these kids are so scheduled now, and especially if you got a kid playing multiple sports, they're going to be pulled in so many different directions, and they have so many people in their ears that if you don't communicate and get stuff on, okay, here's what we need, then you are going to be disappointed, and there are going to be just some different kinds of problems. We would actually talk to the kids about, hey, what do you want to do? Where do you want to be? What commitment can you make? Because there's no point of traveling 3 hours and then not having the experience that you need because 3 of my starters aren't coming tonight or some of those types of things. I think parent involvement, you have to communicate even more than maybe what you had to do 20, 25 years ago.
I'm going to follow on that. Within that partnership, how do you kind of find that balance? You think of, we got to be a little bit flexible because they're doing a lot of things, but we also, we have our standards and expectations, and you gotta be there, right? Like, it's not fair to the other people. How do you find that kind of balance within that? And then maybe when an issue arises, how do you think, going about it or setting it up beforehand, right? To have those expectations, to have those conversations later down the road when there's an issue.
Yeah, well, I think it's all about relationships, isn't it? I mean, it's everything is just kind of knowing who these kids are. And if you put the kids first, a lot of these problems go away. I mean, we all know, hey, Johnny is a great baseball player and that's his love, and he's going to go play travel baseball. Okay, well, how can we work around that so we can do some of this stuff? And what I would kind of tell our coaches or guys that I had that went and took over their own programs is really out of season. There's 2 reasons to do things: is does it benefit your program in whatever way. Is it great for fundraising? Is it great, for getting better? Is it whatever? But otherwise, if you're not getting better in some aspect, it's really probably not live or die. I think sometimes coaches think that, well, my kid has, if he's on our team, he's got to be at everything all the time. But, if a kid misses the Schaumburg shootout, is that really a big deal? I don't know if that impacts winning in November. I think as long as everybody's up front and tells people, okay, here's what you can expect from me, and here's what I can expect from you, I think things tend to work out pretty good. And if you put the kids first and what they want to do, because I think sometimes where you run into problems is if you're too hardcore, you're going to put a kid in position of, well, hey, you're going to make me choose between football and basketball, and hey, I'm a football player, so you're not getting me. And I think you lose some kids that way because you put them in positions where they're going to fail.
All right. So kind of halfway point before we kind of switch and get to the main topic here, we call this halftime adjustments. So obviously you had different stops along the way, right? When you maybe take out the 24, right? Because you were just trying to figure it out and stay, maybe it was the next year or the third year, right? Where you kind of had an idea. But what was your process of kind of figuring out, like, I guess a needs analysis, right? Like, obviously, whenever you come into a program, there's a reason you're taking over, whether someone left, there wasn't success, somebody retired, whatever it may be. How do you go about, what was your process to go about the needs analysis, but also kind of injecting your own ideas and thoughts with maybe something that worked previously, making it yours at those stops?
Well, I think in all spots, no matter where I was, we didn't worry about anything in the past. It was just a situation of, okay, you'd look at who we have. I mean, I think it's like anything. You look at who are we playing? What can we do well? What do they do well? And you try to figure that kind of stuff out. I think that's one of the things that we did pretty well is we played differently every place I was at. When I was at Guilford, we were 85% man to man. I think offensively I went from a 4-out motion guy kind of to a North Carolina secondary type stuff, but on offense, and we kind of stayed with the North Carolina kind of stuff for probably the last 25 years of my career, at least. Defensively, when we were at Guilford, we were pressure. We were, up in 85% man. We trap, press. We do different kinds of stuff. And then when I went to Galesburg, it was pretty much the same. And then I get the Elgin job for a year, and that's all we did was pressure. I mean, we couldn't score at all, but we would play man. And then I go to Hananiga for the last 20 some years of my career, and we played zone. We hardly ever played man. And I think people that know me from Hananiga, oh, he's a zone coach. Well, no, it's just that's what, when I kind of took over there, Rockford Boylan was outstanding, and they were winning sectionals constantly, and they were going 6'7", 6'7", 6'5" across the front line, and my power forward was 6 foot. So, we shot threes. I think we were early on shooting threes before other teams shot threes. Like with all this analytics stuff, if you look at our shot charts from 25 years ago, we were layups and threes, and that's kind of what they do now. And, we played more zone than anybody did when I was at Hananiga, and now you're starting to see some more zone stuff coming in. So I think you just got to sit there and say, what do you do well? What gives you the best chance to put your team in the best position as you can, and then go at it.
Well, you're talking to two zone guys, so you're in the right space, Coach. So as we get
I tell people if I ever coach again, I'm going to pick a school where I can guard people, though. So as much as we had tons of success at zone, is I want to guard people if I coach again.
So as we get into the second half, we're really now going to focus kind of on your 5 different steps as a head coach. And you obviously had an immense amount of success at winning over 500 games in the 5 different high schools. To build off something Todd asked, maybe you kind of talked about the things you did on the court the same at each stop, but maybe what were some things you did off the court, or intangible things or cultural things that you kind of did at each stop? And then maybe what were some of those differences? Because as you said, the Galesburg community and the Rockton community and some of these communities are also very different.
Yeah, I don't know if I did a whole lot. I think what I did differently is how my life changed. When I was in my 20s and single, it was a different scenario than as I'm older and married with kids. It becomes a different thing. I don't know if I really changed how I approach things, and I kind of did stuff the same. I mean, we did what we could do. If we were going to use our contact days in the summer, we were going to have the open gyms, we were going to do the different kinds of things. And I think pretty much everybody kind of approaches stuff the same. I think at different places, when I was at Galesburg, I think basketball was the king sport. That's what everybody kind of wanted to do. At Hananiga, I think that was a little different. I mean, we had kids that were multi-sport kids, and we had, I was fortunate that I have known the baseball coach and the football coach for years, and we were all good friends, and we all worked together really, really well. So, you share kids really well, but I think those are the kinds of things that you have to do differently is just, all right, what's the landscape here, and how do we put these kids in position to reach their goals as best we can. And there's nothing wrong with a kid wanting to be a all conference baseball player and a good basketball player too, and let's help him do those types of things.
So we took two different teams to the state championship game. So in those seasons, what were some of the things, this is kind of a multi-part question, what were some of the things, maybe the intangible things or key moments that kind of led to that deep run? Maybe there was an inflection point somewhere where a game happened or the light bulb clicked on, right? That maybe people don't realize, right? Like those little intangible things. Obviously, everybody sees the talent and the making of the baskets, and you have really good players and this and that. But what are some of those intangible things that lead to a successful run like that?
Well, I think there's moments in seasons where you're going to have some turning points, and you got to be able to coach your best players. When I was at Guilford, we were kind of the Cinderella team that year, where we really came out of nowhere. It was funny. I'm still close to all those guys. I just saw Tony Fletcher, who was one of our stars on that team. Our first conference game, his junior year, was my first year. He's a 6'5" kind of slasher guy, and we're going to say, hey, you're going to face the basket. We're going to play you on the perimeter. We played at Rockford Boylan when they had Lee Lampley and all, Johnny Hernandez and this great team. They ended up getting, fourth in the state that year. And he had like 10 turnovers and we got beat by 30. And he's like, I can't handle the ball, this. And then a year later, he's playing point guard in the state championship game, and to see some of those developments. But our best player that year was a kid named Johnny Rucker. And he was a great player, really one of the best leaders I've ever been around, but also could be hard-headed, and we had a situation where, we didn't think he was approaching stuff the right way. And we said, all right, we got to take something away from you now. And we suspended him for a game. And from that, he came back, and it could have went both ways. And he was by far our best player. And after that, he was the best leader on the floor that I've seen. Didn't care about anything but winning. It was him and I were in lockstep the rest of the way. And I think sometimes I think, kids think disciplines are punishment, but you're doing it to try to help everybody be the best version of themselves. And you got to give credit to him in that, at 17 years old, he had enough trust in me, and we had a good enough relationship where it's like, okay, hey, this is what we need to do, and this is going to make you better and us better. And then all of a sudden he leads us to the state championship game. And then at Galesburg, we had a similar situation. I think if you can have a loss and learn from that loss, you're gonna really grow. We had a kid that Rod Thompson that transferred in from Chicago, was a tremendous player, ended up going to Iowa, and we went down to the KOMWEX shootout in St. Louis and just got hammered. And on the bus ride home, you get those terrible, there's nothing worse than a 3-hour bus ride after you get beat, and we're watching film and calling things out. And he made the mistake of asking, I don't understand my role on the team. then he got the full force of, your role is to, run up and down the floor and, whatever, and all these different types of things. But, I think it got everybody back on the same page, and it got, you got clear cut expectations, and this is what we need from everybody, and this is how we're going to be who we want to be. And I think that's the whole thing, is I think you have to have moments of adversity that you can overcome together. And once you have if you can do that, I think then you have a chance to really take off. And, I think both of those state years, obviously, I think when you finish second in the state, you think that things were easy all year and stuff. Well, no. And obviously we all coach, and, there's nothing easy, and you're going to have those bumps, and you're going to have those different types of things. And if you can survive those, then you get a chance to be really good.
So this is a question we ask guests quite often, and we have gotten direct feedback from listeners that they really like. So, as you went through your career and you kind of went from maybe one school to another school, how did you know that next job was for you? How did you know it was a fit? What were you looking for, when you went from, one school to the next school? And then what were those conversations like when you left one school to go to another school?
Well, like looking back, I don't even know why I applied for the Guilford job at 24. It wasn't like, now I hear kids and stuff talk about, well, I want to be a head coach by the time I'm 30, or I want to be this, and I'm going to be a D1 this, and all this kind of stuff. I never really had those goals. It just kind of worked out that way. I was happy being a seventh grade coach when I first started out, and then this opportunity came along. So then obviously we, with the success we had from Guilford, well, it had been a situation where, Rockford was going through some stuff, and it was kind of time. It had kind of run its course at Rockford, and there was some stuff with the school district that they were facing some challenges. And so I kind of thought about, okay, it might be time to do something different. And, then the Galesburg job was open, and obviously Galesburg has tons of history. They, 60s, they had state tournaments in the 60s. And, I remember, watching stuff in the 70s on TV with, when they would go downstate, and the hi-ho silver streaks and all that kind of stuff. And, that was pretty cool. And so that was why I made that move. And then, you have success. And, the first 7 years of my coaching career, I was in two state championship games. And so people are telling me, oh, you got to go D1, you got to go D1. And, so I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's something I should do. And so I go to Vanderbilt, and it was great. It was, I learned a ton, but I also learned that I wasn't going to be one that wanted to make 15 moves in the next 15 years and chase some of the things that I think people think it's a little more glamorous than it actually is. So we decided that I'm going to come back to Illinois. So I was at Elgin for a year and had a great experience there. But then the Rockton-Hononegah job came open, and that was my hometown. And I had kind of chased it for been around and moved from spot to spot to spot. And I think, being back in my hometown kind of gave us a little more stability, and got me a chance to be around some family and friends. And that was it. So I worked there till I retired, and then thought I was done. Then Matt Stuckey, who was one of my assistants at Hononegah, was the head coach at South Beloit. His wife was sick with cancer, and he asked me if I would come and help him out. So I was his assistant. And unfortunately, she went on hospice, and I had to take over, and then she passed away. And so then I had to take over the next year. So it was a horrible situation. So that's how I ended up at South Beloit. That's kind of my journey of where I went from different kinds of spots to spots. And, but I enjoyed every place I was at. And I think that's one of the big things is, I hear people or talk to young coaches, and they always got this like kind of what's next. I think if you plant your feet and say, this is where I want to be, and this is the job, it's cliche, but make the big time where you're at. If you can kind of have that attitude, I think it kind of leads to other opportunities and leads to different types of things, because, success kind of gets attention more than anything.
So, you obviously mentioned, your former assistants and the South Beloit. I guess really unfortunate situation. Not I guess I know, but you're helping out. You made those connections, right? Former assistant who went on. And I think if you've ever been a head coach, you know how important your staff is, right? And having the right people. So as you were coming into each of these situations, how did you kind of go about building your staff? I'm assuming maybe at some places you brought some people with you, other places you had to build a whole new staff, or take on people from the previous staff, right? Which a lot of times happens in schools. So, how did you build that staff? And then, what things did you do to get, whether it was new staff or the old staff or a combination, to kind of be on the same page and speaking the same language in your program?
Well, I've been really fortunate with that. And I think, one of the things on the years that we were really, really successful or had better years than maybe we had a right to, it was always a situation where my assistant coach was tremendous, and I think, those people are unsung more than anything. Having great staff and people that are taking stuff off your plate, I think is huge. I think I've been blessed by having great people my whole career. When I was at Guilford, like I said, we had Frank Cushing, who was a well-known psychologist, and he knew basketball. He wasn't gonna know. He'll tell you he wasn't an X and O guy, but he was great about dealing with kids and taught me how to, help get the most out of kids from the mental side of different types of things. And he was tremendous. And then I had two of my friends, Augie Toldo, I played college basketball with at Rock Valley, was a great friend of mine. And Brian Hansen, was basically my little brother growing up in Rockton, and just a great basketball guy. And then I go to Galesburg and I get Brian Kern, who's a 6'10" player at Illinois State. And you just give him the post guys and say, here you go. And then at Elgin, I had a guy, Jeff Howard, who was great in he had his son, Marcus, played at Indiana State and ran their youth program. And I think he was, super loyal. And then I go to Hananiga and I get Aaron Jarrett, who's now the superintendent of schools in Rockford, and a great guy and a great basketball guy. And then I end up getting a situation where I had nothing but former players working for me. And so then you're in a situation where they all know, they know the language, they know what operates, what it looks like, what everything does. And so I've been really blessed with having the right people in every situation that I've been in. And, again, you're never successful alone, and, those guys were tremendous my whole career at every spot I've been.
So as we move into our last two segments, the first one we call 30-second timeout. It's your chance to change the subject to anything you want to discuss. You could talk about yourself or your program or your family or something you want our listeners to know about, or turn the tables on Todd and I and ask us a question. And as we say to all of our guests, we promise there is no referee in your timeout, making sure that it's only 30 seconds.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess from a basketball standpoint, like you guys were talking about, well, what do you want to talk about? I think some of the stuff that's fun that I miss is the creative stuff, like how do you hide different kinds of stuff in your stuff from scouting? Like we would do just a bunch of different types of things, but like in our zone offense, we had a zone offense that we'd call 5. So all of a sudden, hey, we're, zone. Well, if we were flashing the 5, that meant we were in our zone motion offense. Okay. But if we would just hold it, that's going to be a set play. And all the set play was depending on what the point guard did. If he stayed, we did one thing. If he went away, we did another. If he made an inside cut, we did another. So now all of a sudden, if you're scouting all the time, dang, 5, they got 19 different things. Every time they call 5, something else is happening, or even things like in our motion offense, if we'd screen away, we would have symbols where there'd be communication. I'd always tell our players that the only time surprises are good is if it's birthdays or babies. But I don't want to see a situation where, guys, how many times have you seen the ball get reversed and it goes to the top, and the guy on the wing that's reversing, he goes back door, but the passer doesn't know he's going back door and he throws it straight out of bounds? Well, all our back doors were, not all of our back doors, but most of our back doors were called. So we'd screen away. If I don't say anything, you're going to use the screen. Okay. If I say your name, you're going back door. If I say a number, well, then I'm going back door. And so all of a sudden we'd be running stuff, and all of a sudden it's like a situation of, why is it that sometimes he goes back door, sometimes he pops, sometimes they curl, all that kind of stuff was communicated on the floor between our guys. And those are kind of the fun stuff that I miss, is how can we hide different types of things? We had a real dynamic point guard one year. We ran a lot of high ball screen stuff. So depending on where the screen sat, if the screener had 2 feet outside the 3, it was one action. If he was split, straddling the 3, it was another action. If he was inside, it was something different. So it's the same call every time, but we're going to run something different all the time. And it was always kind of fun if that kind of stuff worked and you felt like, oh, we kind of hid something there. That's kind of some of the creative stuff I miss.
I'm absolutely stealing that.
We're going to have you back on the show.
I'm going to ask then, follow up before we get to quick hitters, the practice part of that and working on those, right? Because that takes a lot of communication, right? I mean, obviously, if the screener's calling out name, number, doesn't say anything, he's got to be the one reading, right, what the defender is doing, which is not necessarily a natural thing at times, right? Screen away sometimes, especially at the high school level, is hard with the reads.
Yeah.
So how did you go about practicing that to kind of get it to where it was smooth and, you had your slip, you had your curl, you had your backdoor or reject, whatever, because you can't just go say, hey, we're going to do it. And then they do it, because it'll be all right. People will be running into each other, right? So what was the practice format, or how did you work on those little things to kind of get that going?
Well, each of those could come from an initial set. Like we might have a horn set where we know, okay, the ball is going to be entered, and then here's going to be coming the screen away. And then you have your 3 different options, and we would number it. If I wanted, like if I saw something from the bench that I know, hey, the point guard's being overplayed on reversal and we're going to get him on backdoor, I could call that, from the bench if they couldn't figure it out. But we would have all that kind of stuff. And that's the way we kind of structured our offense all the time, is we would always have counters, no matter what. Like, one play is really 3 plays, because, like, let's just say the ball is swung to the top of the key. Well, we got 1 play if we swing it. If we reverse it, then we're into this. If that's denied and we kick it back, well, then we're into another play. And if that is denied, if we can't throw at the top, we've got a 3rd play. So we might say, hey, play number 1, but really play number 1 might be play number 1. It might be play number 1A. It might be play number 1B, just depending on what the defense gives us. And that's what we would try to, we would try to instill that into our guys, is they can't take away everything. We have an answer for anything you want to throw at us. Okay, they're not letting you do this. Well, then hit them with this. And I think that's one of the big things that helped eliminate turnovers, and it helped breed some confidence, is our kids kind of felt like there was an answer to any kind of problem that somebody might throw.
And then once they kind of got the concept of it, was just a matter of repping it and getting it better.
Yeah, it was just, it's just as, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice.
Right.
It's the same thing of you just got to kind of read the situation. And obviously we would give both guys, you talked about, well, it's always the screener reading. Some of that, like if I'm screening away for you and you see that, hey, they're going to jam you to the top of the key and the back door for you is open, you had that right. And then I just do opposite of what you did. But it's just good to kind of, I think it breeds confidence when you can give kids solutions to some of the problems that they may face. And obviously, we can't do that for everything for them, but I think that's where a coach can really make a difference for their kids.
All right. So last segment here, quick hitters, just kind of fun questions to finish out the episode on a fun note here. First one, your best memory from your first year as a head coach?
My first year, well, this is kind of a funny one. Not a great story, because a kid ends up getting arrested. We had a kid get arrested my first year, and we had to kick him off the team. And we get the police report and all this kind of stuff. And we're going through the process with him of basically saying, hey, here's what's happened, and here you violated this code, and, we've got to go. And we end up going through this meeting, and my assistant coach goes, hey, I got to ask you, it says here in the police report that the police caught you running. He goes, you're the fastest kid I've ever seen in my life. how did the police catch you? And the kid looked at us and he says, they didn't catch me from behind. He turned a corner and ran into him. That was a thing. So I don't know if that's the best memory, but that's some of the things I think as a coach, you can't predict of what's going to happen all the year. For me, I think probably the best memory was we won the regional. Like say, I think Guilford won 6 games, I think the year before I took over. And my first year, we ended up winning a regional, and we had one senior on the team. We had one senior, and he was like our 10th man, just a great kid who ended up joining the military and just a wonderful character kid. But really, we didn't play. I mean, we played all underclassmen my first year, and we won the regional, and those kids celebrated like they won game 7 of the NBA championship, and to see that kind of joy. And then for that group to end up being in the state championship a year later was pretty cool.
All right. So Todd and I always say we're going to go to these places someday, but what's a really good secret or lower known place to eat in the Rockford area by you?
Well, you're talking to a dude that likes to eat. When people say, do you lift weights? And I say, yeah, it's usually on my fork. So I know a lot of these restaurants, so this could be another hour discussion here. I would say in Rockton, I think, what I grew up on is Sam's Pizza. I think that's still one of my favorites. It's funny now with cell phones. I was checking out, we had to go to the pet store for our dog, and they asked me, do you got rewards? And my wife does. And then I couldn't think of her phone number, because I had to look up her phone number because I just hit her name all the time, and so they were making fun of me. But the one phone number that I still remember to this day, 624-7535, Sam's Pizza. So you're not gonna go wrong in Rockton if you get Sam's.
The worst bus experience to or from a game.
Because I think that's anytime you lose, I think it's a long bus ride home. I think the bus ride I told you about with Galesburg when we got beat by 30 coming back from the KMOX was a rough one. But the one that I remember, we took vans. We used to go to the State Farm tournament at Bloomington at Christmas when I was at Hananiga, and they'd play games all day long, and the last game wouldn't start officially. It was 9:00, but it seemed like it never tipped off till about 9:45. And we had played the last game, and we weren't staying. I think it was a Saturday night, and we weren't coming back until Monday. So we said, all right, we won't stay. We'll go back. And so the game gets over at about midnight, and now we're driving 2 hours home. Well, our manager got the flu. And so he was, at the hotel, couldn't even come. Well, I'm driving, me and a player and this manager and Josh Keener, and he was getting sick every 10 minutes. So we'd have to pull over, he'd get out of the car, throw up, get back in the car. And it was I think we got home at about 4:00 in the morning from Bloomington. And that was a rough trip. That was a rough one for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you. All right. So you're up 3, there's 5, 6, 7, somewhere under 10 seconds to go. Are you fouling or are you playing it out?
Well, I think there's so many, I think I've done both. I think so much depends on all the things we said before. Who are we? Who are they? What do we do good? What do they do good? Like one of the first things I think of is how much do I trust my defense? If I think we can get a stop and we can play it out, how good's my rebounding? Do I think that we can finish out a possession? If we foul, can we get an offensive rebound on a free throw block out? We used to do an emphasis of the day every day. There'd always be a little basketball saying or some type of thought, and one of ours was every year there's going to be one game either won or lost on a free throw box out. And you watch how many games you're watching, next year in the season, how many games, free throw box out and somebody gets an offensive rebound and that wins the game for them, or someone gets one and it seals the game. Even to this day, I get texts, kids will be watching a game and I'll get a former player send me a text, free throw box out, because somebody lost because they gave up a rebound. So, do we feel like we can get the offensive rebound if we do foul? Because some of that kind of comes into play. So Generally, in a situation, I would say we're probably going to foul, but I've also lost a game because we couldn't get an inbound in after. You foul, you're up one, and now here comes the press and you throw it away. And so I think there's so many variables that you have to think about to answer that question. But I think those are the things that as a staff, you kind of go into the year going, okay, here's what we feel good about. Here's what we feel bad about. And as long as your kids know, okay, like I think our kids would sit there and say, up 3, we're going to foul this year. But then the next year they might be up 3, we're going to play it out because we know we're locked down or we're whatever. And I think when I was more of a man coach, we probably played it out. And when I was more of a zone coach, we tended to foul more. But I think it's basically what do you have that year more than anything.
Are you going on vacation? Are you want to take a road trip or get on a plane and fly some?
I like both. I'm from the Midwest, so a 14-hour drive doesn't scare me. So I don't mind that, especially if I have time. If I have a very limited amount of time, I want to fly and get there and whatever. But now that I'm retired, my wife's still working, but I can't wait till she retires because the idea of just getting in a car and seeing where we end up and, the world's biggest ball of twine, let's stop there. All right. I could definitely get into that kind of lifestyle.
All right. So I know this is going to be a tough one and you can name more than one. Well, who is the best team you've ever coached against?
Well, it probably would have to be in our state championship game. So, Whitney Young when with Quentin Richardson was a great team. But I think the one, which championship team do you want to mention? Whitney Young with 8 Division I players and Quentin Richardson, or the Chicago King 1993 with 2 7-footers, Thomas Hamilton and Richard Griffith. And I think they had 8 Division I players. I'd say King was probably the best team. Funny story, we had a kid, Kevin Rennert was a kid on our Guilford team that was a 6'5", just tough kid that, the kind of guy that other guys in practice would they go, man, go guard somebody else, that kind of guy. And he was guarding Thomas Hamilton, who was 7'4", 330 plus pounds. And they beat everybody by 30 that year. And we were down 7 going into the fourth quarter, and we had a 3 rim out that would have cut it to 4. And so the place is kind of buzzing, and all of a sudden they go high-low with their 7-footers. And Hamilton at 7'4", 300 pounds, is just burying this Kevin Rennert at 6'5", and they scored 6 points right off the bat. So now we're down 13, and I know the game's slipping, and I call timeout, and I'm mad. And Kevin Rennert is like the smartest kid. He went to Grinnell. He's now an atmospheric scientist for the government. He's just a brilliant kid. Like, I could take the ACT like 6 times and still not get the score that Kevin got, And so they go high-low, and he's guarding him. And I'm like, Kevin, you got to fight around him and see the ball and not let that ball go down there. And he just looked me in the eye, and he goes, Coach, I can't even find the ball. And I just kind of looked at him and I go, keep trying. And it was over. It was over. And it was funny. After the game, we watched the film, and all of a sudden you'd see this big body, and then this little hand, this little hand would come around and, try to stop him from getting the ball. But he didn't have much of a chance. But yeah, that King team was that team. I think that King team could probably make an argument of being in the discussion of best teams all time, Illinois.
Well, Coach, we really appreciate you being on today. The stories were awesome. I know our guests are going to be really entertained by your stories and some of the things you gave as lessons and your different stops. So thank you for your time today. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the After the Timeout podcast in partnership with the IBCA. Please be sure to rate us on whatever platform you are listening and give us a 5-star rating. For more show content and updates, please follow us on Twitter at After the Timeout. As always, thank you for listening. Tune in next time for more content on the court, off the court, and anything in between.